chamber we are about to pass into does not literally exist within our planet. It is simply the gateway to a vast tract of hyperspace. It may disturb you. It scares the willies out of me. Hold tight! Welcome to our factory floor. This is where we make most of our planets, you see.
You mean you're starting the whole thing up again now?
Oh, good heavens, no, no. The galaxy isn't nearly rich enough to afford us yet. Now we've been awakened to perform just one extraordinary function for the very special clients from another dimension. It may interest you. There in the distance in front of us. We're making a copy from our original blueprints.
Are you telling me you originally made the Earth?
Dance lessons. Press 68.
And 1, 2, 3, 4, step 2, 3, 4, slide.
For Prisoners of Gravity, the truth about science fiction. Press 3.
Angry mobs attacking mutants in The New Mutants. Ethnic fighting erupts between aliens and humans in War of the Worlds.
For the Armchair Conductor, enter 17.
Soft, soft. And here a little time.
You have selected the Armchair Conductor.
Good evening and welcome to the Armchair Conductor. Tonight you will learn the art, the craft, the sublime subtlety and infinite grace of the first 17 bars of the William Tell Overture.
Club Dave is a virtual interactive service of KPBS San Diego.
In the news, skinheads attacked immigrants in Germany, Sweden, Holland, Spain, and France. Race riots in South Africa, India, and Canada. Angry mobs attacking mutants in The New Mutants. Ethnic fighting erupts between aliens and humans in War of the Worlds. And charges of discrimination were raised by the Quaddies in Falling Free. But first, man flees planet and ends up lost in space. Film at 11.
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick. It wasn't until 1966, in Fantastic Four number 52, that the first black superhero appeared. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's The Black Panther. 6 years after that, Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, a cheesy Shaft ripoff, became the first black character with his own title. A year later, in '73, the Black Panther got his own title too. Since then, the number of minorities in mainstream comics has, at least tripled to 6. Still, the issue of racism is being addressed in comics, although it's usually as a metaphor. The X-Men face a lot of hostility because they're different. But recently, in The Whitest of the Whites, Superman, writer Louise Simonson took a more direct approach to the issue.
There's overt racism and there's covert racism. And I think that even people who try not to be racist sort of instinctively slip into it, whether they mean to or not a lot of times. I think that as time progresses and as the world becomes a smaller place, that hopefully it will become less so.
And did you want to hurry that process along with your story about the racism that was taking place in the Daily Planet's hiring practices?
The reason I personally wanted to do it was we have a young friend of Hispanic background, and he complained that in not just the Superman books, but in most of the superhero books, everybody seems to be a white male. You know, there are few women and there are few other races represented. So I said, all right, John, I guess you're right. So John Bogdanov and I decided we wanted to do this scene. And of course we discussed it with everybody else because that's what you do when you do the Superman titles. But it was decided that this would be a theme that would run throughout a number of the stories as a subplot.
And then they go kill Superman off. Mind you, Soup is being reincarnated in 4 new versions, one of whom is black. For a more realistic portrayal of racism, check out The Alternates. Love and Rockets by Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez features Hispanic characters. Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning Mouse is a devastating look at anti-Semitism between Nazi cats and Jewish mice. And ever since New York comic legend Will Eisner began creating semi-autobiographical comics in the 70s, racism has been a returning theme in his work. Will, there's a remarkable scene in To the Heart of the Storm in which you change your little brother's name to Peter because you don't want people to know he's Jewish.
It's a true story. As a matter of fact, he's still called Pete, and he has to put it in parentheses when he signs official documents because he's known as Pete. It's a true story, yeah.
You've really put racism in the spotlight since you started doing graphic novels. What do you think are the roots of the problem?
As creatures, we're afraid of anything that looks or is different than we are. It's a threat. If we are white, somebody whose skin is a different color is a foreign element, and foreign elements represent a problem or a danger and so forth. We have to consciously learn to accommodate ourselves to living with that. And it's a very subtle thing, and that was what attracted me to it as a subject area, because in this medium, it's very hard to deal with subtle things because you're dealing with images that solidify or condense an idea. And when you condense something like orange concentrate, it's pretty solid stuff and doesn't allow itself for any subtlety.
If you try to do any ethnic or racial or national group, there will be people who jump down your throat because you're doing a representation. And one of my favorite stupid letters, and hopefully, since this is going to be on in Canada, the person who wrote this letter will hear this and know that I thought it was stupid. When I did Alpha Flight #1, Jim Hudson, Guardian, comes home from a tough day at the office, and his wife offers him a cup of tea. Let me make you a cup of tea. And I got this letter from this person tearing a strip off me because, damn it, we drink coffee in Canada, you know. And I said, yeah, but we drink tea too. You know, this isn't supposed to be definitive here. But they get off on these things, you know.
We accumulate images of what we think people who are engaged in certain kinds of things look like. We learn to trust and not trust somebody based on stereotypical images. Those of us who are either in film or in comics or in the visual arts learn very early on to employ those visual touchstones, if you will, to make our case, and we're using images. So I think the reinforcement or the support or the proliferation of imagery, of stereotype by the use of images is not the danger. I think the danger is how you use it, the way the Nazis did, who tried to create an image of a Jew and began using it detrimentally, or the way people in blacks did. As a matter of fact, Alfred E. Newman, the Mad Magazine character, was originally an anti-Semitic image. It was kind of an idiot Jew, which was the idea. Mm-hmm. So I think it's how it's used. Alfred E. Newman is used very nicely now. It's kindly in a way, inoffensively, if you will.
But Gilbert, you know comics thrive on stereotypes. So how do you subvert that with your material?
I try to avoid some of the stereotypes, which, you know, because after all, cliches and stereotypes are based on something. So I try to avoid, like, say, the machismo, the Hispanic culture, and try to emphasize the female side of it. Even though it is true, there is a machismo in Hispanic culture. I just try to de-emphasize that just because we expect that. I wanted to put in things about the Hispanic culture that you just didn't expect, like warmth, friendliness, just what everybody's culture goes through,
Right. Do you see yourself as a spokesperson for the Hispanic community in a way?
Oh, no. I just basically tell stories I want to tell, and I think they're coming from a different angle, so I just think it's interesting that way. I mean, when most cartoonists say, well, I'm going to do a story from a different angle, it'll be about outer space, or it'll be about somebody who turns into a plutonium man, or something like that. That's okay, when you're a kid, but how about telling a story from a different angle from people who really are here, what the world is really like, and hopefully, having the reader warm up to these types of stories.
Fear not, there is something new and exciting happening with mainstream superhero comics and with Dennis Cowan, one of the first black creators. Dennis penciled and co-plotted the Black Panther and drew the infamous lynching scene in The Question, issue 15. A few years ago, Dennis explained the situation facing creators of color.
Comics is still, this is going to really get me in a lot of trouble, folks. Comics is still, the white male club, and until more minorities do something to change that, it's always going to be a white male club. As one of the few black creators of prominence at this point, that's going to change. At this point, it's my responsibility to do that as well as my desire. Time for Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, and I can name numerous other incidences, is over. So that's the thing I want to change. I think the only way you can change that is if black creators, women creators, minorities, Chinese creators, gay creators, take control of their own projects, and hopefully through the mainstream companies like DC and Marvel, get product out there that would change people's perceptions.
To that end, Dennis has signed on as creative director for Milestone Media, a new line of superhero comics distributed by DC. The milestone in Milestone isn't only the skin shades of the superheroes in the city of Dakota, it's that black comic creators will control their characters. V-Mail, is it from Control? Or from where? Dallas, eh? Well, Oswald's dead, Ruby's dead. Oh, I know who that's from. Patch it straight in.
Yo! Ho! Ha! Hey! Ho! Ha! Commander Rick, how's it going? It's me, Dan Piraro from the battleship Bizarro. I was just sitting there playing with my piñata, thinking about racism. I understand you had a show about it today. Had a couple thoughts I wanted to share. The deal is, what's the point? I mean, there's a lot of jerks in the world that you could hate. Hate them once you get to know them. There's nothing wrong with hating somebody who's a big jerk. There's nothing wrong with hating somebody who hates everybody. I like to hate people who hate people. That's one of my favorite things. But there's no reason to hate somebody just because of the way they look. I mean, if that were the case, everybody would hate Sally Struthers. But they don't. She's a wonderful woman. But I'll tell you, racism, people are too sensitive. They're too sensitive now because of racism. Everything's a racist comment. You can't say Oriental, you have to say Asian. You can't say black, you have to say African American. And now they're calling white people Anglos. Anglo means English. I'm not English. I'm Italian Irish. Close to English, but I'm not English. So don't call me an Anglo. Why should I get upset? A lot of people say, never mind. I've got to go now, Commander Rick. I've got stuff to do. So, the bottom line is racism is bad. The book is good. Buy hundreds of copies. It's been nice visiting with you. This is Spaceman Dan from the Battleship Bizarro saying so long.
Those white Irish, Italian, Texan cartoonists are all the same, stupid piñata heads. In the Best of Bizarro, Dan occasionally lampoons racism, always with his trademark bizarroness, but racism has never been an issue in most daily funnies because it's so hard to make it funny. In fantasy fiction, authors have dealt with racism fairly often, usually as a metaphor, you know, Beauty and the Beast. But a few fantasy authors have addressed racism directly. Andre Norton's stories feature a collage of creeds, colors, and cultures. Andre, it's Commander Rick. I was wondering, why are so many of your heroes from underdog societies, such as the Navajo and the Bantu?
Because they haven't had a fair deal. I had a Negro character in Storm Over Warlock, and they refused, the publisher refused at that time to allow him to appear on the jacket as a Negro, or any reference in the book to Negro. So I purposely put a Negro in the crew of the, now I'm using the word Negro because I react badly to the word black. I don't like it. I put a Negro in the crew of the Solar Queen. And North American Indian heroes interest me very much. I have North American Indian friends from different tribes. And we're supposed to have a drop of Indian blood from back in the 18th century.
Oh, really? Maybe that explains why your Navajo hero in Beastmaster seems so fully rounded.
Yes, and I even got a Navajo phrase book from the government so I could work out his language properly.
What sort of reaction have you received from members of the various cultures you've portrayed in your books?
I had a very nice comment from one Negro librarian on my book, the Lavender Green Magic, which the whole cast practically are Negroes in that. And she said to me, I am so glad that somebody at last is writing about a Negro family that are not from the slums. I was writing about a middle-class Negro family.
And what year was that story?
That was back in the 60s.
Wow. Thanks, Andre. Andre was one of the first fantasy writers to consistently create characters of color. Over in science fiction, the pioneer for black characters was Samuel R. Delany. Delany also became the first black SF author to win a major award when Babel 17 won the very first Nebula. Were you the first black writer in SF?
As far as I know, I was the first. Now, of course, there are, there's Octavia Butler and Charles Saunders and Steve Barnes, so that there's a, you know, that there are more of us now than there were a few years ago. Science fiction was traditionally a kind of haven for liberals anyway, and so it was not, there was no, I didn't have the feeling that I was fighting through any kind of particularly virulent sort of prejudices, or, although there were every once in a while there was the odd incident. There, you know, I remember John W. Campbell, you know, rejecting a novel of mine called Nova because, quite specifically because he did not want, he didn't think the readers of Analog were ready for a science fiction novel with a black main character. And, you know, the book was published. It stayed in print. It's one of the few of mine that I believe is still in print. So it obviously had a certain amount of popularity with precisely the readers that Campbell was so worried about, offending, you know, when he rejected it many years ago.
Naturally, you have a lot of black characters in your books. Was that meant to be a deliberate political statement?
Well, I wanted to do something new and different. The idea was not so much to do something for political reasons. It was to do something aesthetically new. I wanted to write a novel that wasn't like everybody else's novel. And I think this is what, you know, any writer comes to a field to do, or any writer who anybody's going to find worth reading. They want to do something that's different. And so I'm again, even back as far as Babel 17, I remember saying, well, you know, gee, why aren't there novels about, you know, about a woman? Why aren't there novels, instead of being about an engineer, about a poet? And that was, you know, but I saw the choice at the time primarily as aesthetic. I wanted to do something that was, you know, aesthetically different. So you choose a different kind of subject matter, a different kind of way of telling the story.
Science fiction usually tells the story of racism through metaphor. The other is often a brother from another planet. In Barry B. Longyear's Enemy Mine and H. Beam Piper's Little Fuzzy, it's no fun being an illegal alien. The other in SF is the mutated human. In The Time Machine, Planet of the Apes, a nuclear war and then the passage of a few thousand years produces weird new mutations who are at each other's throats. More recently, Karen Haber used mutant humans as her others when she and her husband Robert Silverberg expanded his short story The Mutant Season into a novel. Karen then went on to write 3 solo sequels that show racism is a two-way street, both dead ends. Does showing your mutant characters as not just victims, but also as perpetrators of racism, strengthen or weaken your story message?
Oh, I certainly hope it strengthens the story. I think the complexity of human relationships is not easily depicted in fiction, and there's not one cause for racism, and you often have the victim just as angry and just as biased as the oppressor, although not always.
Can any story that uses analogy to explore racism be as powerful as, say, a novel that tackles it head-on, like In the Heat of the Night?
Well, in terms of power, if you mean ability to hold the reader's attention, I think that's, yes, absolutely. If you mean the charge that comes from dealing with a contemporary issue, well, perhaps not as much, because, of course, it's cloaked, it's softened. You have either a metaphor or some other disguise for it. And, of course, with science fiction, in our field, you're doing so many different things. Again, the intent is not to lecture. Right. The intent is to tell an entertaining story that the reader wants to read. And if you have a moral, that's fine.
And yet, certainly, In the Heat of the Night succeeded in doing that and didn't feel like a lecture either.
No, not at all. I didn't mean to make it sound that way. But it was created for a very specific reason with a very different point of view. And, well, you're talking about the difference between science fiction and contemporary fiction, and there's quite a difference.
The differences are somewhat lessened when a science fiction story forgoes metaphors and deals with humans. For example, Spider and Gene Robinson's Starseed features a veritable United Nations of Earthlings, including a WASP Canadian, a Chinese American, and an Australian Aborigine. Of course, only the Snow White Canadian appears on the dust cover. Is there much racism in the publishing industry?
Well, there's an interesting topic. I have a novel I wrote called Night of Power. It's one of my favorite books. Well, that's a self-serving thing to say, but I like it a bunch. It has to do with the takeover of Manhattan Island by black militants. The publisher, the editor who commissioned it, left that firm almost at once, and the entire rest of the editorial department at that publishing house responded with horror at the idea of a conspiracy of black militants seizing Manhattan Island and holding it for ransom. It was maybe because they all lived in Manhattan. They were contractually committed to publish the book. They gave me back the book, and I sold it to someone else who, after he bought it, took a look at it and then forgot to put it in his catalog. Is that racism? I honestly don't know. I have never met anyone in the publishing industry I consider to be a racist. But then I don't consider me to be a racist either. And maybe now's the time to tell the funny little story of Charlie Saunders' wedding. There's a writer in Halifax, Charles Saunders, one of the few black fantasy writers in the world, and a very good one, and a friend. Charlie asked me to be the toastmaster at his wedding. I was flattered and honored. Hey, how cool can it be for a white guy to get asked to be toastmaster at a black wedding? This is, wow, my liberal credentials are now solidly established. So the wedding happens, and we're doing the thing afterwards, and I'm doing my toastmaster number. I'm telling snappy little jokes, and it's working. The room is laughing at my humor. I'm very pleased. And I get to the story of how when Charlie arrived in Halifax, the first thing they told him was he was going to need eye surgery on both eyes. He had double cataracts. So attempting to relate this anecdote humorously, I say, and Charlie's arrival in Halifax was perhaps not inauspicious when the very first thing they said was, "Congratulations, a strange white man is going to stick a knife in both your eyes." And I get a laugh, and a man stands up in the back of the room, 50 or 60, and about 4 shades darker than Charlie, and says, "I beg your pardon, sir. I am the white man who stuck the knife in Mr. Saunders' eyes." And through the floor, I've just blown my cool credentials. Well, racist? Who, me? Oh, yeah. None of us think of ourselves as racist. We sometimes make decisions we think are done for other reasons that turn out to be racist.
Yes, as Will Eisner said, it's reflexive. But perhaps things are changing in the publishing industry. William Wu has produced a number of SF tales featuring Asian American heroes. His novel Hung on the Range features cyber cowboy Louis Hong in a future Wild West of robo-cows and bionic bandits. And Wu explores traditional Chinese myths and folktales in a series of short stories that follow Jack Hong's odyssey across contemporary America. Why did you set some of your Jack Hong stories in such unusual locations? The Ozark Mountains, the Mississippi Delta?
A lot of people are aware, if you travel by car around the United States, you can find a small Chinese restaurant in almost any town of any size, sometimes in some little bitty towns. And people tend to forget that these are often run by Chinese immigrant families, and they have children who grow up in these areas. And so we have a very widespread geographical experience, which is not reflected by the belief in most people that Chinese Americans mean big city Chinatowns and nothing else.
Is there much of a difference between a Chinese character in one of your books and one written by a competent white or black writer?
I really think that the viewpoint of someone from inside any definable group, whether it's national or gender or political, anything, is fundamentally different from those of people on the outside. And so what I wanted to do, and one of my guiding memories, is to try and write something that I would have liked to see or perhaps needed to see when I was young. How would I have felt if I had discovered one of my young adult books at 12 years old, or at 18, or at 25? And so ultimately, you might say I'm writing for myself when I was younger.
At the 1992 Worldcon in Orlando, William Wu was on a panel entitled, "Ahoy, have you seen the Great White Archetype?" Afterwards, my agents in control talked with another panel member, Goingback, whose stories deal with prejudice and Native American culture in fantastic settings.
What kind of misconceptions are you trying to dispel about Native American culture with your work?
Basically, by being here, I'm trying to dispel the illiterate Indian stereotyping that the Indians have no intelligence, they can't be writers, they can't be actors, and things like that. I'm trying to do that. When I write and when I go to a panel and I dress like this, I'm representing an entire nation of people. So everything I do, I want to do in a positive light so it reflects back upon them.
Does it, I'm noticing that you won a costume award. Does it bother? Well, how do you feel about that? I mean, this to you is more than a costume, obviously.
This is not a costume. This is my regalia. Any other time, I take great offense about it being called a costume. But I did not take offense at it for here, the place we're at, because they gave the ribbon, although the ribbon says costume, it was given because of what I was wearing and the work and the effort that went into it. And traditionally, the Native Americans, if you check back the old pictures, they loved colorful things. Ribbons and campaign buttons and things like that were always added to the regalia. Although I won't wear these are my dance clothes. I'm a traditional dancer too. I will not wear these ribbons when I go out into the dance floor. But it was nice to get.
Jewelle, one thing I loved about the Gilda stories was that you mixed European, African, and Asian legends with African-American history in a vampire story. Considering that you chose to express your political stance in a piece of genre fiction, you must be delighted that the Gilda stories is now being taught in university courses.
I don't feel that, I think it's exciting, my book has been accepted in some courses as texts, but I don't think the academic center is the center of the universe. I don't think that's where change is going to come necessarily. I think the development of us as human beings comes from just, the people I grew up with, the people I went to school with, the people who are on their bowling league, like my best friend, I go home and she shows me her bowling trophies, and, her daughters call me aunt. These are the kids I want to be able to say, oh gosh, I really am interested in this. It is that popular front that can shift, how we think about ourselves in the world. And it is harder to get people to believe that things can be different when they're the ones who are going to make, to make the job every day. It's very hard for them to figure out they've got any power to change anything. That's why I wanted to write something that's popular, in a genre that's popular, that because I think that is where the power is, essentially.
And the power of fantasy, science fiction, and even comics is the power of imagination. Remember, the first interracial kiss on television was on a science fiction show, Star Trek. And the new series, Deep Space Nine, shows all kinds of races and species cooperating. So hey, if the Klingons and the Romulans and the Ferengi can learn to get along, maybe there's hope for humans and humans and humans. Next week on Second Nature, the true story of a plane crash in the Himalayan mountains that left 13 survivors stranded for weeks until, desperate and starving, they succumbed and began eating the airline food. Also, the world's first solar-powered tanning machine.
And we're going to have so much music.
Do a new one if they want, but